In this session, we will learn about critical reasoning, one of the most important and interesting topics on GMAT. So remember, the success and the failure of your critical reasoning section on GMAT essentially depends on how critically you think. Basically, it is inversely proportional to how critical you think. The more critically you think, the less is the success, and the less critical you think, the more is the success. And if you don't think at all, success for sure. I understand it's pretty paradox, but that's how it works on GMAT. Alright? Let us take a look at an example. Let's assume two people, A and B, are talking about taxes. Right? A says taxes must be reduced. Why? Because if taxes are high, people end up paying more money to the government. If people end up paying more money to the government, they'll have less money to spend. If they have less money to spend, they do less shopping. If they do less shopping, which means less businesses. And less businesses, business may even shut down. And that will give rise to unemployment, which is a serious problem. Right? Now, on the other hand, B says taxes must not be reduced. Why? Because if taxes are low, then the government will have no money or less money to spend. Right? If the government has no money to spend, then they will borrow the money from the market. If the government borrows money from the market, from where will the people borrow? Right? When you know that you can't borrow money from anywhere, then what you do? You increase your savings. Right? So when the people increase the savings, what happens? The cash flow stops. There is no cash flow. When there is no cash flow, the economy comes to standstill, which is a serious problem. Is it not? Now you tell me, is there an agreement between A and B with respect to taxes?
No.
No, right? There is a clear-cut disagreement between A and B with respect to taxes, and this disagreement gave rise to an argument, and this argument is what is called as critical reasoning on GMAT, right? Now, you tell me, what is structurally similar between A and B?
Both of them are talking about their effects on the taxes.
Right. And if you carefully notice, you see that both A and B have taken the stance, have taken the position. A says taxes must be reduced and B says taxes must not be reduced, right? And the stance is what is called as conclusion. And they have substantiated the stance by giving their own reasons. And these reasons are called as premises, right? So therefore, the two important elements of critical reasoning are conclusion and premise. Okay? So what is a conclusion? Conclusion is a statement that the author wants to convince you about or wanted you to agree upon. Okay? GMAT uses other words for conclusion. Other words for conclusion are hypothesis, plan, position, claim. Whenever you see these words, we know that this is nothing but conclusion. Right? And then, what is premise? Premise is nothing but statements in support of conclusion. Okay? Great. Now, let us take a look at an example and understand this better. Alright, now let us do an example and understand this better. Go ahead and read the first example.
The Highway Traffic Safety Institute reports that the PS1000 has the fewest injuries per accident of any cars in its class. This shows that the PS1000 is one of the safest cars available today.
Right. So according to the HTIC report, PS1000 has fewer injuries per car accidents. Right. So therefore, PS1000 is the safest car available. Is it not? So they are trying to convince us that PS1000 is the safest car available. So that point becomes the conclusion. And they base the conclusion on the HTSI report. Therefore, HTSI report becomes a premise. Right? HTSI report is a premise and PS1000 is safest car available becomes a conclusion. Right? So this is how a typical argument looks like. Remember, it is very important that you identify the conclusion correctly. If you don't identify the conclusion correctly, you may end up selecting the wrong answer choice, and we don't want that to happen. Is it not? But sometimes GMAT helps us to identify the conclusion correctly by placing certain trigger words in the argument. Let us see what are those trigger words. Go ahead and read those trigger words in the box.
Therefore, so, suggests, as a result, consequently, thus, indicates, hence, accordingly, it follows that.
Right. So whatever statement follows these trigger words is nothing but the conclusion. Right? Great. Now let us do another example and understand how GMAT places these trigger words in the argument. Alright? Now go ahead and read the argument.
A factory was trying out a new process for producing one of its products with the goal of reducing production costs. A trial production run using the new process showed a 15% reduction in costs compared with the past performance using the standard process. The production managers therefore concluded that the new process did produce a cost saving.
Right. So here the argument says factory wants to introduce a new process with the goal of reducing the production cost, right? So therefore, they did a trial run, and the trial run of new process have shown 15% reduction in the production cost. Therefore, production managers have concluded that new process did produce cost savings, right? So here, the last statement is the conclusion, right? And then we got two premises, premise 1 and premise 2. Tell me, which one is the main premise?
Premise 2.
Premise 2, right? The second premise is the main premise, because the production managers have based their conclusion on what happened in the trial run, right? So the second statement becomes the main premise. As you have seen in this case, sometimes you may have more than one premises. However, there will be one main premise which you need to identify. Okay? Now this is how a conclusion with the trigger word looks like. Alright? Now let me give you two important points. One, conclusion is the most important point in an argument. Two, conclusion must be arguable either ways. What do I mean by that? For instance, in the previous argument we did, where we said production managers have concluded that new process did produce cost savings, we can argue with the production manager saying new process did not produce cost savings, right? During the same time when the factory was implementing the trial run for the new process, maybe the raw material cost would have come down, maybe the labor cost would have come down. There could be so many other things that would have happened during the same time that might have created the same result, right? So here we can definitely argue with the production managers. The conclusion is certainly arguable, right? Perfect. So that's how the conclusion should look like. Is that clear?